Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Damon Levine, and I'm a facilitator here at PRUDE, and I want to welcome you to our ongoing Black History Month speaker series. This is a series of free, interactive online talks by presenters from around the province who will share stories on many subjects related to both Black history in New Brunswick and the present-day Black community here. This includes talks, or will include talks on subjects ranging from Black loyalists and Black refugees to famous firsts, entrepreneurship, personal uplift, and poetry reading. So the subject of today's walk is a famous first. The subject of today's talk is a famous first that, quite frankly, should be more famous than he is. Abraham Beverly Walker, A.B. Walker. He's Canada's first Black lawyer. And to tell us about A.B. Walker today, we have a man who quite literally wrote the book on A.B. Walker. St. John native Peter Little is a retired senior production planner for Irving Oil. He's a freelance writer and historian who has authored 3 books, including Abraham Beverly Walker, Lawyer, Lecturer, Activist, which I have right here. It's a biography of A.B. Walker. In addition, his writing has been featured in such publications as the New Brunswick Reader, the Fredericton Region Museum's Officers' Quarters, and Generations, the Journal of the New Brunswick Genealogical Society, Incorporated. Peter is currently compiling the Black Census of New Brunswick, which will include the names of all the province's Black residents from 1824 to 1921. Finally, Peter is a member of the board of the New Brunswick Black History Society. So it is my honor to welcome Mr. Peter Little. Hey, Peter.
Hi, Dan. Well, thank you for inviting me today.
You're very welcome.
SpeakerSeries. So let's get started. Over 130 years ago, long before the phrase Black Lives Matter became part of our lexicon, there was one lone New Brunswicker campaigning for that very thing. And that man was Dr. Abraham Beverly Walker, and this is Black Lives Matter circa 1880. Now, there's a couple things you need to know about, or should know about Dr. Walker going forward before we get started. The first is that he was a very devout Christian. The second is he was a staunch royalist. He was British to the core. And the third one we'll get to in just a second. But those two things and the third will come up over and over again as part of his tenets of his philosophy. Now, Abraham Walker was born in 1851 in the small farming community of Cars on Belial Bay, and the family farm is indicated on the screen on the map by the wider blue arrow. He was one of 8 sons and 3 daughters to William and Patience Walker, and they were of Loyalist descent. Now, he was likely a very bright young fellow. He started his academic career at the one-room schoolhouse in Cars, which is indicated with the narrow blue arrow here. But after finishing the primary grades, he moved over to the larger school in Kingston, Kingston being the shire town of the county back then. And that's where he caught the eye of this man, the Reverend William Elias Scoville. Now, Scoville was the priest in charge at Trinity Anglican Church in Kingston. And the unique thing about Scoville was that he had developed his own brand of shorthand note-taking. And during the next few years of school, he would mentor Abraham Walker, and Abraham would master this method of shorthand note-taking, and it would hold him in good stead for his career going forward. Along around 1870-ish, his father passed away, and the family moved to St. John, Abraham, his mother, and a couple of sisters. Although they were Anglican by faith, they were quite involved in St. Philip's African Methodist Episcopal Church in the South End, especially the ladies, and later his wife were quite involved in committees at St. Philip's. One of his first jobs, however, he managed to put his shorthand note-taking skills to good use, and he went to work for this man, Orson Squire Fowler, who's a noted American phrenologist. Now, phrenologists is those quasi-scientific, quasi-quack type guys who figure they can determine a person's intellect by the size, shape, and feel of their skull. So Abraham started working for him, transcribing notes, and they traveled throughout Canada and the US. But eventually he became Fowler's understudy, and he too mastered the art or the craft or whatever we'd like to call it. It's really a science of phrenology. But one of the other places they visited was the UK. And it was here that Abraham Walker had his first epiphany when it came to race relations. When he came home, he wrote that every Black Canadian should make at least one pilgrimage in their lifetime to either Ireland or England to see just how fairly Black people are treated there. Because with the exception of the nobility, there was Blacks at every level of society. So after a couple of years working for Fowler, he came home and he went into business for himself. And he set up a shop at the corner of Princess and Canterbury Street. Canterbury? Yeah. And this location is going to hold a little bit of significance for Abraham going forward. But his business was, he hired himself out as a stenographer, a shorthand note taker, scribe, but he also taught the Scoville brand of shorthand note taking. And as well, he did phrenological examinations. So that was, I only just stumbled onto this fact just a month or so ago, so it was quite interesting. So a couple of years later, he decides to put down some roots, well, sort of, as much as he could. And he married a woman from Nova Scotia named Eliza Ruth Marsh, and they began a family, and they would eventually have 5 children, but sadly only one would survive long enough to have children of his own. But Abraham had a hunger for knowledge, and under the mentorship and with the encouragement of a local lawyer, George Gilbert, he enrolled in the law school at the National University in Washington, D.C. in 1878. And 3 years later, after completing his studies, he returned home and was sworn in as an attorney to the Supreme Court in New Brunswick. Now, the next year, of course, he was admitted to the bar. And he opened his first law office on the same, well, there's the courthouse. Opened his first law office on that same corner of Princess and Canterbury Street in the Ritchie building. But unfortunately, he struggled quite a bit to make a living at it. Racism in St. John at the time was systemic and institutionalized. It was deeply ingrained. He had a difficult time getting enough clientele to make a living. Not only that, but he had to endure the slings and arrows from his colleagues. And they ranged over the years from racial insults in open court from opposing attorneys to being snubbed from attending Law Society functions, to having his name taken off the Queen's Counsel and King's Counsel list twice, simply because of the color of his skin. So things weren't easy for him. But that epiphany I talked about him having in the UK, I believe, was the spark that lit the flame inside his belly to campaign for civil rights. The first, and he began almost right away. The first lecture that I could find record of that he gave on the subject was in 1884. And it was held at the Mechanics Institute here in St. John. And it was called A Glimpse at the Present World, or the Decline and Death of Civilization. Quite a scary topic for Victorian age conservative St. Johners. But Abraham Walker wasn't above opening the drawer of angst just a little bit to get his audience's attention. But he started out, his first appeal for civil rights started out quite tamely. He just appealed to the white man's sense of reason and logic and Christian values, like we're all humans, we're all brothers. There's no difference in us. But you know, of course, it fell on deaf ears, as you'll soon see. Now, he continued to speak on the lecture circuit, and he would be paid for these lectures and actually sell copies of them at the door, which helped augment his income since he was having a difficult time as a lawyer. And by the next year, in 1885, he had given his drive for civil rights, or his philosophy, a name, and he called it Christian Socialism. Now, it sounds like a political movement, but it wasn't. And matter of fact, he said, "I'm not a politician, and I hope to never become one." So, you know, right away, the man's pretty intelligent. You want to avoid that profession. In his brand of Christian socialism, he was not against capitalism per se, but he advocated for a good deal more of the wealth to be poured into wages for the workers. He also advocated for that all property in the province to be held in common for the common use of everybody. And the other tenet of his philosophy, I mentioned that the first there was three. This is the third one, is he advocated for free, universal Christian education. Black schools in St. John were at best an on-again, off-again thing over the years. And education was the big push that he said would help level the playing field between whites and blacks. And surprisingly enough, he had also advocated for universal suffrage. Now, this is 32 years before women were given the right to vote in Canada. And not only did he say that women should be given the right to vote, they should be given an active role in government, because they can only make things better because men have really messed it up so far. So, as you might expect, in a white patriarchal society, these comments didn't go over very big. So as time goes on with no progress at all on the social agenda, he begins to ramp up the rhetoric, and he openly berates both Canada and the United States for their treatment of the black citizens. But what surprised me was that he was especially hard on Canada. And he said that nowhere in the country is there a single black man in the public service anywhere, not even the lowly justice of the peace position. Now, he made this comment shortly after his first snub at the Queen's Council, so he was still a bit bitter, and that was just a kind of a dig at the federal authorities. So, as a way to remedy it, he decided he was going to move to Atlanta, Georgia. He'd go down, get himself established, and then send for his family. And on the face of it, on paper at least, Atlanta looked like an ideal spot for a young black professional to open up a business. The demographics of the city were just about a 50-50 split between black and white. There was black schools, black churches, black businesses, a black university. So things looked really good. So off he went down to Atlanta, and in just a little over a year, he's back. And on his return, he figured the grass isn't always greener on the other side of the fence. But on his return, his attitude toward the Americans, which are quite full of praise before he left, had taken a drastic 180-degree turn. And he made three predictions a few years later about the United States. Two of them have come true with uncanny accuracy. The first one was, and he was only off on his timing so far. Let's hope the third one is different. But he said that during his lifetime, he could see he would live to see the day when a black man held the most powerful position on the planet. Now, it's not much of a stretch to equate this with the election of Barack Obama in 2008. His second prediction was the rise of populism in the U.S. And probably the most accurate description of Donald Trump without actually putting his picture in the paragraph that I've seen. The third prediction was he saw the demise of the American Republic altogether, saying that only another bloody civil war would save them in the end. Excuse me. So anyway, he's back in St. John, reopens his law practice, but again, it fails fairly quickly. So he takes a position with the St. John Law Society as the law librarian. Now, either fortunately or unfortunately, depending on how you look at it, this gave him more time to work on his social justice causes. And he began spending so much time on it that eventually he lost the job as the law librarian. But also during this time, the St. John Law School opened. And again, this is at another corner of Princess and Canterbury Street. This law school was associated initially with King's College in Windsor, Nova Scotia, later became the UNB Faculty of Law. And when it opened its doors, A.B.Walker was the first student of any color to enroll there. Now, he'd already had his law degree, he was just taking some extra courses. So he, once he lost the law librarian degree, or job, he poured himself full-time into his quest for equal rights. And his first major treatise to the public in general, he issued in the spring of 1897 as a 6-part series to the St. John Globe entitled The Trials, Hardship, and Destiny of the Negro Race, an appeal to the tribunal of humanity for fair play and justice. So Christian socialism became fair play and justice at this point. And he begins this series, excuse me, with an analogy of a foot race between two competitors. There's a well-fed, well-trained, well-equipped man with all kinds of cheering supporters, and then there's a poorly fed, poorly trained, barefoot man who has no supporters and is jeered by his opponent's fans. At the end of the race, of course, the well-fed man wins, but only by half a nose length. The well-fed man in this analogy is the white race, and the other chap is the black race. The whole gist of this analogy was that if the field of education, the educational opportunities, were equalized and blacks had the same opportunities as whites, they would be able to establish their own great statesmen and great theologians, great intellectuals and businessmen, and so on. And education, as you'll see, is a constant thread that runs throughout his all of his lectures and his writings. He said, leveling the playing field with equal educational opportunities is the key to social and economic emancipation. And one of his favorite quotes, well, one of my favorite quotes of his, is this: education expands the mind and gives elasticity to thought. Education expands the mind and gives elasticity to thought. And it's always struck a chord with me. Too bad I didn't hear it 50 years ago when I was in school. Pay attention to it. Anyway, A.B.Walker himself was a very highly educated man. By the end of his life, he had several degrees. He spoke 5 languages fluently. He had a passable knowledge in another 4. He was a brilliant orator, and he was very well read, especially in the classics. He was also a man of the highest moral standards, and according to his obituaries, he never spoke ill of anybody. However, he did save some harsh criticism for some of his own black citizens in St. John on one occasion. There was an incident uptown where some young white men managed to coerce a group of young black men into entertaining them with minstrel songs and dance. And you know, the whole minstrel thing was born in the racist South. Initially, it was white people in blackface, but anyway, he lit into them in an op-ed piece in the paper in 1897 that was really quite scathing. So it wasn't good to be on the sharp end of his tongue. The New Freeman, likewise, the Catholic newspaper of the day, that will still exist today, they caught his ire at one time for their criticism of Zola, the French philosopher, when he died. Anyway, with no progress on his social agenda going forward, we start to see something creep into the lectures and his writings that we just got a peek of in the analogy of the two racers, and that is the idea of black superiority. He pushed this theory quite a bit toward the end. His whole premise was that the black race was the first race on the planet, and that's a theory that is still relevant today. That's the mankind, as we know it, originated in Africa and spread through Europe, Asia, and eventually to the Americas. And Abraham Walker was expounding this idea back, just before 1900. As a matter of fact, three of the greatest civilizations of antiquity were all black civilizations: the Phoenicians, the Ethiopians, and the Egyptians. And it was his theory that all other races, Caucasian, the Asian, the Indian, and so on, all sprang from the Negro race. Now, again, I can't imagine this been very popular with the local ruling whites in society, but he went a step further. And at the time, he made another prediction, saying that it was the absence of Christian love that spawned the evil practice of slavery, and it's going to be the absence of Christian love that accounts for the downfall of the white race. And he predicted that within 500 years, the white race will fall from dominance, and the Negro race will be uniquely situated to once again be the dominant race on the planet. At one point, his frustration started to bubble up to the surface, and I would have been frustrated a lot sooner than this if I was him, but at one point he mused about how much fun it would be to turn all white men as black as crows for at least a month, so that they could experience firsthand what his people have experienced for centuries. Now, 50 years after his passing, another great civil rights leader said, 300 years of humiliation, abuse, and deprivation cannot find voice in a whisper. Well, Abraham Walker was not about to go out in a whisper. There was still no progress on what he termed the Negro problem, the problem being inequality. He began to push for something a little different. And, oops, there's a slide. I should have mentioned these guys before. St. John Minstrels. I don't imagine Abraham Walker collected many of their CDs. They were making a fortune over in London. Anyway, his next big push, he wrote about extensively and lectured extensively as the president of the African Civilization Society, and that was an en masse immigration of all educated black Canadians back to Africa. He figured the black man is not going to get equality with the white man. The only way to get it is independent of the white man. You'll notice that he was only going to take educated white people or black people with him. He could not abide laziness at all, and anybody he deemed lazy Negro, he was more than happy to leave behind. He said he was willing to take a few Americans with him, but this would not solve their problem with their race problem. But he was also open to taking a few educated and sympathetic white people with him. So the goal was to establish a British-style colony in Africa with British laws, British customs, and eventually, once they've established the nucleus of this colony, to gain self-governance from England, and then branch out with the goal of Christianizing the entire continent. It's a tall order. Africa is a huge continent with many complexities. And he wasn't, it may seem like a utopian idea and a very high bar to reach for, to be sure, but he was under no illusion. He said, this idea is fraught with all kinds of bewildering perplexities and difficulties. But I think he was up to the task. And it's like he formed this African civilization movement in 1905, but he'd been campaigning for this British colony in Africa for a few years before that. But this wasn't the first time it was tried either. In the 1870s, the Reverend Henry McNeill Turner took a group of 500 black citizens from southern U.S. to Liberia to set up a new colony there, but it didn't work very well, and in very short order, they all came home. But Abraham was not, he was not to be deterred or discouraged by Turner's failure, and he pushed ahead. Now, to promote this, his idea, he approached everybody from the local citizen on the street to the prime minister. He actually claimed to have the support of John A. Macdonald for this idea, but he only had two methods of doing it. One was a written word, and the other was a spoken word, being 100 years before mass media. And to that end, he published a magazine in St. John here. The first issue came out in February 1903. The magazine was called Neath, and it was very highly anticipated. There was some columns in the newspaper where the general population was actually looking forward to reading this magazine. And he had quite a lot of prominent contributors, members of the government, members of the clergy, local historians. Each magazine was about 60 pages in length, and 50% of that was dedicated to the issues of race. Now, he made no apologies for this at all, because he said Canadian publications, be it newspaper or magazine, ignore the race issue entirely, and American publications act like Canada doesn't exist. So he made no apologies for using so much of the magazine as a platform to promote race issues. One of the contributors to the magazine was his son George. George was the only one of the 5 children to survive to adulthood, and George went on to become a minister in the AME Church, and this is him outside the church in Shelburne, Nova Scotia. He had a parish in Shelburne and Yarmouth, and George later moved to the United States. And the other method he had of getting his message out, of course, was spoken word, and he did that by lecturing around the country. And I have found newspaper clippings from Nanaimo to Halifax talking about Dr. Walker's talk on the African civilization movement. And the funny thing is, the most detailed accounts come from like Nanaimo and Saskatoon and places further afield. Newspaper accounts locally just said, basically, Dr. Walker gave a talk on the African civilization movement last night, period. So These two clippings, one from 1901, one from 1905, you can see in one case he was in Halifax, and one of the members of the audience was His Royal Highness the Duke of Cornwall in York, and the other one he's in Toronto, having just returned from Europe. So he really got around. And it was while on one of these speaking tours in Ontario that he fell ill. He was taken to the doctor and diagnosed with tuberculosis. And he returned home, and he lingered on ill for a few months. And in the last 5 days of his life, apparently, were quite bad. And he was laid to rest in a St. John's cemetery in an unmarked grave, and simultaneously swept under the rug of history. That is until 2019, when he was posthumously awarded the Order of New Brunswick on his first go-around, and it was a unanimous vote by the committee. And I thought this would be the crowning glory of all the research I did into Dr. Walker's life, but I was wrong. The icing on the cake was being able to, that's me accepting the award. The icing on the cake for me was being able to turn right around at the same ceremony and present the award to his great-granddaughter, Debbie Little, and her son, David, who came up from Michigan. I had looked for 2 years for descendants of the family and just kept running into roadblocks and dead ends and gave up. And although I felt at times Abraham had his hand on my shoulder at different times during this research, I think he intervened at this point, because 6 weeks before the ceremony, they found me. So once again, thank you, Damon, for inviting me. I'll leave you with one last word from the man himself. This quote, I think, should be painted at the front of every classroom in every school in the country. A man should not be measured by his race or his color or his creed, but by the size of his soul or his heart or his mind. Thank you for inviting me.
Peter, that was just a fascinating, informative talk on the life of A.B. Walker. Brilliant stuff. Listen, and thank you. I have some questions.
Sure.
So so he's working for this phrenologist, Fowler. So how did Fowler square having A.B. Walker, who is clearly brilliant, working this whole phrenology racket? Like, do we know anything about that?
Not specifically. It was kind of a strange coupling, because phrenologists in general were always of the opinion that black folk were only suited to the most menial jobs. Exactly. It was just a pseudoscience based completely in racism and Yeah. They were quacks. So I was surprised to learn that Abraham was actually practicing the craft. Mm-hmm. But the other thing about phrenologists, generally, they were members of the abolitionist movement before the Civil War.
Really?
Yep. So it was.
Oh, so I see what's going on. So these would be they're abolitionists, but I'm sure they have what we would today maybe call like a white savior complex, where they looked upon black people as almost like like poor puppies, like, oh, we have to save them, but we don't really consider them human, that kind of thing.
Yeah,
I got you. Is there anything recorded of what Walker thought about working in with this phrenology racket?
No, a lot of his. I'm sure he had a whole collection of papers.
Yeah.
But like I say, when he died, his wife died almost 2 years to the day afterwards.
Okay.
And George was away. He was living in the States. Yeah, he was survived by one daughter, but she died either that same year or later. She got married and then died within a year from tuberculosis. So his papers probably got turfed.
Did his his line went to Canada? We don't know. Sorry, his line went to the United States. We don't know of anyone else in his line in Canada, right?
No, not direct descendants. He had when he died, he was survived by two brothers, both up in Woodstock.
Yeah.
So, that's 8 members of the family that died predeceased him. So.
Okay. It's funny you mentioned that he very much a disillusioned royalist, and I'm reminded of a few things with that one. I'm reminded of Gandhi, also another sort of royalist who had his eyes open, I believe, when he went to South Africa, right?
Yeah.
And I'm also reminded, you say that Walker was really, he spoke quite well of the treatment of black people in the UK at the time, in the late 19th century. Do we have any ideas as to his experiences over there, or why he spoke so highly of Britain for black treatment?
Nothing real specific. Just I found in his writings that he was really pleased with the way that race relations were going in the UK.
Right.
There was no overt discrimination, and blacks were at all levels of society, except, of course, for the nobility.
Yeah.
But nothing real specific.
It's interesting with Britain, and honestly, I think you see this with a lot of societies in the world in general. If the out group is not necessarily large enough to pose what the in group or the majority group considers a threat, then there's no problem per se. But we compare Walker's comments on blacks in Britain from the late 19th century to 50 years later, when the first Afro-Caribbean immigrants come over en masse on the Empire Windrush in 1948.
Yeah.
And then then there is an issue with race in Britain, and Britain starts to look more like what we know from North America as far as racist incidents. So when the numbers weren't as great or perceived to be as great, then there was no problem. But had he lived half a century later, he would have clearly seen that things were very much similar in Britain as they were in Canada and the United States.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. When did he die? What year did he die?
1909.
1909. Okay. All right. Just shy of the First World War.
Yeah.
Well, that's fascinating.
Yeah.
Let's see if we have any questions here. I guess we don't.
The other thing, you mentioned the First World War. He during the Boer War, he lambasted the British government for not allowing blacks to fight in the Boer War.
Is that right?
Yeah. So he was a few years ahead of his time there too.
I tend to think that, because you said that early on in your talk, you said that he was very sort of pro how blacks were treated in Britain, but judging by his writings as his life went on, I think he got more disillusioned with the racism in the world, in the Western world per se, and I think he cottoned on to the fact that Britain was no better than any country in the West, in the Western Hemisphere.
Oh yeah. His attitude changed even toward the Americans. Like, he was singing their praises before he went to Atlanta.
Mm-hmm.
A complete reversal when he came back, but toward the end of his life, he softened his position a little more. And of course, Teddy Roosevelt had come to power, and he had appointed a black man not to the cabinet, but to a senior civil service position. And
right.
He started to ease off on his criticism of the U.S.
That's fascinating. That is fascinating. Well, Peter, I want to thank you very much for sharing this information on A.B. Walker today. I hope it's something that people hear and do a little bit more research on, because he really is just a fascinating New Brunswicker, and he's a New Brunswicker, a black New Brunswicker that more people should know about.
Oh, absolutely.
Peter, so before we go, where can people get your book, Abraham Beverly Walker, lawyer, lecturer, and activist?
There's some copies available at the Black History Society.
Mm-hmm.
Get a hold of Ralph or you probably.
Okay. Or they can go to the New Brunswick Black History Society website and email us, and we can talk to them there about the book. The address is nbblackhistorysociety.org.
Yeah. And I've got a few copies too. There's probably still some in the bookstores.
Okay, so people
But,
can, is there any way that people can contact you?
yeah, they can. I guess they can get a hold of me on the email or telephone.
Okay, do you have an email address you'd be willing to share?
Yeah, that's genealogy@bellalliant.net.
Okay, genealogy@bellalliant.net to get in touch with Peter Little. And Peter, finally, are you going to be doing any more speaking about A.B. Walker anytime soon?
Tomorrow night.
Where will that be and what time?
That's for the Fredericton Museum. It's 7 o'clock, I think.
7 o'clock tomorrow night at the Fredericton Museum.
Yeah, it's a Zoom thing.
Okay, and if people want to get in on that, they can just go to the museum website.
Yeah, I think it's best to call them. I tried to get hooked up myself through their website and couldn't find it, but I'm not very technologically advanced. So.
Okay, so I would if people want to hear Peter's talk on A.B. Walker tomorrow at the Fredericton Museum, it's a Zoom thing. Contact the museum for information.
Right.
Peter, listen, thank you again for joining our speaker series. It was brilliant information, very engaging, and we thank you.
All right. Pleasure to be here, Damon.
Thank you. You have a great day.
You too.
Bye now.